Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Education, Preparation, and Licensure Subcommittee of the State Board of Education. Subcommittees joining us today are Mr. Bob Eby and Mr. Mike Edwards. Thank you all for joining us as we hear important presentations from the State Board and Tennessee Department of Education teams. And as always, we have a lot to cover today. And before we begin, I do want to call on Dr. Sarah Morrison, the Executive Director of the State Board of Education, for her opening remarks. Dr. Morrison.
Thank you, Madam Chair and subcommittee members, all of our partners who are joining us today. It's going to be a good discussion, lots of timely topics on the agenda as always. I'm looking forward to the input from our board members and also our friends at TACTI and others who've joined us. I want to say too, I think this subcommittee has been in meeting for quite some time now, several years at least. I think it was the first subcommittee that we formed as a board when I came as executive director about 6 years ago. And as I think about the work moving forward, particularly the special session bills that just passed that are, both time sensitive and critically important to the future of our Tennessee students coming out of this COVID time period, there's going to be a number of decisions that'll come back to our board related to some of that work, namely EPP literacy standards, potentially a new reading assessment, some things that really could be game changing for the state. And I know that working with the department, we'll be coming back to this subcommittee, potentially even before our next May quarterly meeting, with some of those topics that aren't even on today's agenda. So we've got a full docket, and just a preview, I think there will be more things coming down the pike for this group over the months to come. So certainly looking forward to the conversation today, and I will turn it back over to you, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Morrison. I do want to remind all of our presenters that you please state your name for the record, and we're going to get dive right into the agenda with the first item, which is the 2020 Educator Preparation Report Card. Ms. Erica Light.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair. I just have a brief overview first of the items that we have on our agenda for today. So as you mentioned, I'm Erica Light, the State Board of Education Senior Research Associate. And the first item on the agenda is the 2020 Educator Preparation Report Card. That will be followed by an update from the Department of Education about their annual reports on educator preparation. We will then have a discussion regarding licensure reactivation and renewal, a discussion about PE and specifically the requirements to obtain a PE endorsement. We'll follow that with a discussion with TDOE staff about the proposed additional endorsement pathway. And then we will finish out with a discussion with our friends from the TACTI Executive Board, several of whom I can see are already here with us today. So the 2020 Educator Preparation Report Card, as you know, was released recently. Just as a reminder that we have two different sets of educator preparation reports here in Tennessee. The State Board of Education Report Card is a high-level report that is designed for external stakeholders. It highlights EPP performance on key state priority areas, and it is a public-facing accountability mechanism. So anyone in the public can get onto this website and find out information about Tennessee educator preparation programs. On the other side, we have the Department of Education annual reports, which are more detailed than the report card, but these are EPP facing. So only the EPPs themselves can view them, and they can only look at their own program's data. So these serve a different purpose from the report card, and they also are used for formal accountability in that they set the minimum bar for programs to continue operation. If a program fails to meet expectations for 2 consecutive years on the annual reports, this will trigger an interim review conducted by the TDOE. The 2020 Educator Preparation Report Card was released on February 11th, 2021. So as you know, the report card is a somewhat backward-looking instrument. We have to wait a year between when someone gets their license and when we look at their performance so that we can see how they're actually doing in the classroom, which means the most recent cohort that we have in this particular report card is from 2018-19. A lot of the data that was included in this most recent report card is from before COVID, but we did have some data changes or data challenges due to lack of teacher evaluation data from the 2019-20 school year. And as a result of these missing data, EPPs did not receive an overall performance rating this year. They still, however, did receive information about their provider impact metrics, which includes teacher observation scores, TBOS, and LOE. None of those items were available for 2019-20, but we do have them for earlier years, and so that data from earlier years is included in the report card. It just was not used for scoring purposes. We also had a new score domain this year, which is the candidate assessment domain. It was introduced last year as an unscored domain, and it specifically looks at pass rates on required educator licensure assessments. And we decided in consultation with our report card advisory council that this was a good year to begin scoring this because it was a nice way to fill out more data in this report, considering that we did not have teacher evaluation data from the 2019-20 school year. This slide shows an overview of the scoring framework for the report card this year. So a candidate profile is a measure of how EPPs are doing at recruiting racially and ethnically diverse candidates and also at training candidates in high demand endorsement areas. The point values for this domain are exactly the same as they were on the previous report card. So 20 points equally divided between those two metrics. The employment domain is also the same as it was last year. So EPPs can receive up to 9 points for second year retention and up to 6 points for third year retention. As a reminder, we decided, starting with last year's report card, to remove points from the first year placement metric, which that metric is still reported, it just is no longer scored. The reasoning for that was also based on input from our advisory council. There are many EPPs that are located near a state border, so they have many people going to other states, or they are a religious institution and they are primarily preparing candidates for religious private schools. And therefore, their primary mission is not necessarily placing teachers in Tennessee public schools. But we do want to see that when they do place teachers in Tennessee public schools, that they have some staying power. So that's why we are still scoring these retention metrics, even though we're not scoring the first year employment. Finally, we have the new score domain of candidate assessment, which is divided into pedagogical and content assessment. With, again, input from the advisory council, we decided to put slightly more point value on the pedagogical assessment, primarily because the current pedagogical assessment in Tennessee is the EdTPA, which is a performance-based assessment. It's very intensive. It requires a lot of work from both the candidate and the EPP. And our advisory council thought it was appropriate to reflect the amount of work that goes into that assessment by having a higher point value on pedagogical assessments. EPPs did not receive an overall rating this year, but they did receive a rating in each of the 3 scored domains, which were candidate profile, employment, and candidate assessment. The names of the ratings are the same as they were last year, and the percent ranges are also the same. So none of this is new information, but you need to get at least half of the points in order to meet expectations. And if you get 3/4 of the points or more, then you exceed expectations. We had a couple of new features on the report card this year. One of these was new disaggregations. So the provider impact metrics, which again are observations, TBOS, and LOE, while we did not have point values associated with these this year, we did make it possible to view disaggregated data for different endorsement clusters. And one new endorsement cluster that we've added this year was career and technical education occupational. This is a separate category of teaching license that several EPPs offer, and it's an important area that has not previously been covered in the report card. So we were glad to be able to include this for the first time. We also included in the report card, there's a list of each endorsement area that an EPP offers. Previously, occupational endorsements were not included in that list, but now they are. So candidates can see which occupational endorsements are offered by an EPP. I actually just got an email from an EPP earlier today saying that this particular disaggregation, not just the occupational, but all of the cluster disaggregations, were particularly helpful for them because they can see this information in the annual report for their program only. But on the report card, they can look at how other programs are doing and figure out where their relative areas of strength are so that they can figure out who to partner with in particular areas of clusters. And that was great to hear. So I'm glad that that was helpful to people. Finally, we also have a new disaggregation for in candidate assessment. There are a couple different types of assessments that candidates need to take to get a teaching license. One of these is the subject area assessment, which measures the candidate's content knowledge in the area that they will be teaching. But there are also a number of endorsement areas where an additional assessment is required that specifically measures candidates' knowledge about teaching reading. So if you are getting an endorsement in elementary education, early childhood education, middle grades, or special education, you would need to take this literacy assessment in addition to your subject area assessment. On the annual report, it was already possible for EPPs to look at their literacy assessment pass rate separately from their subject area assessment. So we decided to add that feature in the report card as well. In terms of next steps, we're getting close to being ready to start data collection for the 2021 report card. The first step will be to pull the most recent cohort data out of TN Compass. And then we will, as we always do, send that data to EPPs during the summer so that they can review it and supply additional information about those candidates, and also confirm that these are in fact the correct candidates that are in their program. That's a joint process with the Department of Education. We use a shared data set with them for this part. Then in July and August, roughly, we will review the data that was submitted by EPPs and clean it to prepare for producing the report card. We then merge the cohort data with data about employment and retention, licensure assessments, and candidate satisfaction. Those are all data that are collected by the Department of Education that we get access to through a data sharing agreement. And we also are planning this year to reconvene the Report Card Advisory Council. It will have some members continuing from the previous year and then some new members as well. The important topics to discuss include continued data limitations due to COVID-19. Since the report card is a backward-looking instrument that covers 3 cohorts of teacher candidates, it'll be several years before we will have a complete set of data again with no gap due to COVID-19. So we need to continue to account for that in how we are presenting and scoring data. We also are continuing to consider additional scored metrics such as the candidate satisfaction metric, which is based on responses to the Tennessee Educator Survey. That information is currently included in the report card for informational purposes, but is not scored. So at this point, I guess I will ask if there are any questions, but then I will turn it over to my colleague, Michael Zerline at TDOE, to give an update on annual reports.
Erica, this is Lily, and I do want to certainly thank you for the great work that you continue to do. And I know that you are always standing ready to listen to our ed preparation partners and taking their feedback and input. I'm just curious to know if you have received any new themes that perhaps have not been addressed today, or any ongoing concerns about the report card, because I know over time there's been a lot of iterations to the report card and listening and trying to make sure that the report is reflective of the performance of the ed preps. So I'll stop just to see if there's anything that perhaps you could shed light on relative to ongoing feedback from our partners. I know we have Tacti on the phone with us, on the call with us, and so perhaps they will share some insight later on, but I just want to ask you at this point. So thank you.
Thank you for that question, Madam Chair. I have gotten a little bit of feedback regarding the possibility of scoring the satisfaction domain. We do want to make sure that if we score that we have some standards in place for minimum response rate that would be required. And we would also want to look at if there's some sort of systematic difference in answers on that survey between different types of candidates. So as you know, we have traditional teacher preparation candidates who complete their program and then they get their license and then they go into the classroom. We also have job embedded candidates who get their license at the beginning of their program and are in the classroom while they're still in their program. So before we would attach points to that metric, we would want to look for systematic differences between those different types of candidates.
Thank you for that. That certainly makes sense.
Madam Chair, may I tack on?
Yes. Yes, Mr. Eby.
Yes, I just want to say that I was really glad to see you're going to get the advisory panel back together this year. Going back to your comment, Lillian, I think that's an excellent way to get feedback from EPPs and the stakeholders, and they certainly aren't shy to give us feedback. And I enjoy participating on that panel, but I think it's an excellent process to get feedback to help direct and provide some information for where we should be going in the future.
And I agree with you. Thank you for that.
Madam Chair, may I jump in as well?
Yes.
Thanks. Amy Owen, Director of Policy and Research for the State Board. A couple other questions that have come up, and it's a little bit, it's still kind of in the works, but as we know, there's been a lot of discussion about how are we teaching reading, how are we preparing candidates maybe to do more virtual instruction than in the past. Just COVID has surfaced a lot of issues, and not just the data challenges that Erica covered, but also, you know, looking forward of how are we preparing people for expectations in the future. So as Bob said, that's something that we certainly want to discuss with the advisory council if there's a revised literacy assessment or if there's different expectations in other ways that are established in the future. As Erica said, the report card is really a retrospective, but thinking about are there any ways we could incorporate more narrative on what an ed prep is doing to meet certain expectations. So those are some other areas that we will bring back with the advisory council.
Thank you for adding that. Other comments? Then we'll turn it over to Michael.
Good afternoon, everyone. Michael Derline, Senior Director of Educator Licensure and Preparation at the department. I think I have rights to move this forward. I can figure it out. Hey, look at that. My updates are going to be fairly brief. We are kind of in our final stage of production. A few reminders here, though. We are not bound by a legislative date, so we do have a little bit of wiggle room that the state board does not, which is good because our report, as Erica noted, gets to a much greater level of granularity than the report card. And so there's a fair amount of review that has to happen in various stages to make sure that the data we're putting out there is accurate. Also, just a high level reminder, the annual reports are comprised of two different tools. One is the performance report, and that is the accountability tool. That accountability tool, kind of like the report card, trees up various domains into an overall meets or does not meet expectations for an EPP. It is also tied directly to the 7-year comprehensive review as we integrate the metrics from the performance report into that ongoing approval process. And as Erica noted, it can trigger an interim review if a provider falls below expectations in 2 consecutive years. The Insights tool is that really, really granular, detailed, continuous improvement tool that EPPs can interact with and disaggregate their data in many different ways. So that's the one that typically takes a little more time for us to review before we get it out there. But currently the files are with STS, the state vendor that produces annual reports, and we anticipate we'll be able to release them before the end of this month. A few updates, which are somewhat similar to the updates that you heard from Erica. Domain 5 is our provider impact and effectiveness domain. This year, it's not going to be consequential for the very same reasons that Erica noted. The report card is not, it's not a scored metric on the report card. What that means is we are still going to have an overall meets or does not meet designation, but in the past, domain 5 was a required component. So if an EPP did not meet the provider impact and effectiveness domain, they would not meet overall. That will not be the case this year. Also, and by the way, I wanted to note that all of these updates come from feedback from the Educator Preparation Working Group. We've had a number of conversations with them about potential modifications to the annual reports, and so these come out of that group. The ACT SAT metric, we're not removing it entirely, but it is being removed from the performance report. So it will remain on the Insights tool, but a conversation we've been having for the better part of a year now is that metric's sort of interaction with another metric in the same domain around recruitment of diverse candidates. I know the board has been very interested in admissions assessments and processes, and we're having a host of conversations about that with the Educator Preparation Working Group. And so that was a decision point that was made quite a while ago. And so that will be removed from domain 1 on the performance report. And then lastly, even though we produced the Insights tool, which is a really interactive, detailed tool, folks want more. They want a flat file that has even more data they can dig into. And so this last time we met with the EdPrep working group, we tried to really figure out, well, what exactly do they need? What are they looking for? What would they actually do with it? And ultimately where we landed is they would like more detail around that domain 5 provider impact and effectiveness data. So while we do provide information at the endorsement program level, they want that information at the candidate level, and the law actually allows them to have this information. So we are currently working on developing a file that we would send probably shortly after the release of annual reports, but this year, that would give them that data that they can use internally. And you know, when we talk to providers about, well, how would you actually use that? Why do you want that level of detail? There are a lot of reasons. So EPPs have their own internal assessments. They have evaluations by clinical mentors, and to be able to kind of compare those sorts of things to the overall outcomes would give them a whole lot of power in understanding if the content within their program is actually aligned to the way folks are being evaluated once they're in the field. So that's all I had on annual reports update. I'd be happy to take any questions you may have. I know once we release them, we'll have a whole lot more to share as far as where providers landed on meets and does not meet designations, if we have anybody that will then have to go into an interim review and those sorts of things.
And Michael, this is Lily, and I do want to add a similar comment to what I said to Erica, because the responsiveness that you display as well as Erica in listening to our EPPs, I think is critically important. You're demonstrating that you care deeply about what they want to know, what they need to have at their disposal. And I completely understand their desire to sink their teeth more deeply into the kind of data that you have at your disposal. So thank you so much for that. I'm sure they appreciate it, and we'll share that later if they have an opportunity. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Madam Chair, Bob Eby.
Yes, Mr. Eby.
Sitting here looking at this, hearing one presentation side by side, brought me to the question, have we ever looked to see how the scores for the state board report card and the TDOE report align? I know they use different criteria. some criteria is similar and same, and some is different. But it would be interesting, I think, to see how closely they align and overall meets, don't meet, have we ever done that?
Michael, you're muted, but we do it every year. Perhaps we should do a better job of sharing that out with our members. That's a great point. Michael, what were you saying?
Yeah, I was just saying, totally agree, and we have done that every year. And it's actually a really good idea for us to do every year, because what it allows us to do is provide a rationale for why there might be slight differences. And note that that's okay. We have slightly different business rules, but for the most part, we see alignment. If a provider falls below expectations on the annual reports, they're likely not going to perform as well on the report card either. Occasionally, we'll have cases where that's not necessarily the case, but in every case thus far where that's been the issue, there's a reasonable explanation for it. So great point. I think we could just do that again and then share it with you all.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think that would be helpful. And I think there'd be some valuable information that would come from that would be helpful to the EPPs too. So like I say, they probably look at it, but that would be good. Thanks.
Yeah.
Those are the folks who usually flag it for us of why did I get, this score over here from the state board, but this different score over here from the department. And as Michael said, we prioritize different things. We use the same set of data, but between the board members and the advisory council and the different focus of being more like a consumer reports for the report card, as opposed to the annual reports where we're saying, are you meeting the bar to maintain operations? We do end up with different results now and then, not all the time, but that's a great point. We can certainly share that back with y'all. Do I have control? Did the slide just change?
It did.
Great, thank you. Then we are on to a pretty broad discussion of licensure, reactivation, and renewal issues that Michael and I will tag team a little bit here. And this is one where we're really just interested in your input and some direction, because there's a couple different ways we could take some of these things, and TACTI folks will also be interested in your thoughts at the end of the meeting. The first slide is just a preview of two pieces of potential legislation that are under consideration right now. So these are two bills. We don't know if they're going to pass or be amended, but just wanted to make you all aware of them, because if they do pass in a similar format to what they are now, it would affect our licensure rules and policies. So the first one is Senate Bill 1450, House Bill 1294. And it requires the board to renew educator licenses that have expired if that educator holds an active certification in another state that we are in kind of a broad reciprocity agreement with. In other words, if I got my Tennessee license and I moved to Georgia for 10 years, my Tennessee license has expired, I could use my Georgia license to reactivate it, for example. So that would affect our rules and policies. Currently, those folks would need to take a licensure assessment to renew their license. So that might be something you see coming up in terms of rule changes. And the second one is Senate Bill 479, House Bill 533. This is also about folks coming in from out of state, but who don't have a previous Tennessee license, who have simply never been in Tennessee in the first place. Currently, there's two different things that can happen with those folks. If they are on their initial license in the other state, they're what we would call a practitioner license. They have to take their praxis exam up front before they're issued a practitioner license in Tennessee. If they're on their professional, their more advanced level license in the other state, they get issued the practitioner license in Tennessee. And if they meet certain evaluation scores in their first few years, they do not have to take a praxis assessment in order to advance to the professional license. So they start on the practitioner, but if they have high LOEs, they don't have to take an assessment, and then they get the professional. This would kind of wipe out some of those additional steps and say that when somebody's coming in from out of state, if they're coming in with a professional license, they just get the professional license. There's not this practitioner first, high LOE or assessment, then professional. This also includes a pathway for educators who came in the last few years to Tennessee under that pathway where they would need high evaluation scores, because we haven't had evaluation scores for a couple years. We had COVID for 2019-20. For this most recent year, educators are able to nullify their scores, if I understand the hold harmless legislation correctly. So if those were your 2 years of my first 2 years coming in from another state, suddenly you would need to take that licensure exam because you wouldn't have your evaluation scores available. So this legislative proposal would essentially allow those people to advance to their professional license on the recommendation of their director of schools, or I believe charter schools are also accounted for in that, because they don't have their eval scores. So questions there. And like I said, this is just an overview for you. This is their current format. We all know things can change during legislative session. Great. Right, there's a lot of text on this slide. I'm sorry in advance. We are now thinking about folks who have a Tennessee practitioner license, which is the first one, what kind of license you get, and it is valid for 3 years and it can be renewed once. In order to advance from a practitioner to your 6-year professional license, our current rule and policy have a number of requirements. One of those that we want to focus on today is that educators must obtain 3 years of qualifying experience as defined by the department. And we've gotten a lot of questions about what this means over the years. Michael's team has put out a very detailed guidance document so that folks know exactly what this means. And some of it is quoted below, that it is no less than 25 months of full-time work, at least 1 year or 10 months, so August to May, must have been within a Tennessee public or approved non-public school. That has to be while the educator held a valid license. Substitute experience is not acceptable for this. But if you are doing an internship as part of your clinical practice, it can count. And there's a few more kind of provisions there. So it's this no less than 25 months, 10 months of which is in Tennessee. So keep that in the back of your mind as we go to our questions. Some of the questions and comments that we've gotten as a staff are situations where somebody got their license in Tennessee and moved not just to another state, but maybe even out of the country. They've been teaching abroad. So one question is, should that requirement that at least 10 months of teaching in Tennessee remain, or should it be just teaching experience anywhere? I'm going to go through the questions and then we can kind of have an open discussion. There's also a question, we now have integrated early childhood endorsements that cover birth through, I believe, 3rd grade, Michael, or birth through kindergarten. Previously, we have not allowed experience in settings like preschools or daycares or Head Starts to count toward this required experience. Should we open that up, given that we now have a license type that covers this area? And finally, on first reading in February, we proposed a change to the licensure rule that would allow candidates to complete all of their clinical placement at Category 2 and 3 non-public schools. So should we update the requirements and the guidance to indicate that those types of experience are very clearly permitted? Do you have questions about my questions, or would folks like to dive in?
Amy, this is Mike.
Hey, Mike.
Is there a difference, since we're talking about teaching elsewhere, including abroad, is there somewhere that we define what kind of teaching is being considered for credit?
You're cutting in and out a little bit. Is the question, how do we define teaching for these purposes?
Yeah. So, with the teaching, if things are teaching from abroad,
Mm-hmm.
and is there a definition of what teaching is?
Gotcha. Michael, is it in the guidance document? Do you want to go for that?
I can try. It almost sounds like you're asking if we have a definition of teacher of record, which is, it's funny you should say that because I was just emailing with folks about that. I don't know that there is a formal definition of teacher of record. When we collect experience, it typically comes through 2 different pathways. So one is either it's recorded directly in our licensure system, TN Compass. That's if somebody is teaching in a Tennessee public school. The other is through what's called an experience verification form. That form is filled out by the employing entity and details the role that the individual was serving in, what they were teaching, the specific dates that they were actively employed in that position. And that is factored into this as well. So for example, if somebody taught in Kentucky for a few years, we're not going to have that experience in our licensure system. So the district in Kentucky would need to complete that experience verification form. That then gets attached to the educator's record and is considered in these licensure transactions.
Amy, this is Bob Eby. Can I add on to something Mike point that he just raised?
Let's do.
Yeah, I look at this and I think, daycare, you've got that listed as a possibility that daycare would count as teaching. And then Michael's comment about teacher record. I know for a fact that homeschool people who homeschool their children, they are teachers of record for their children. And so I think we've got to be real careful. First and foremost, we want the quality of education, the quality of teachers for our students. And so I would be real careful that we have some evaluation process and not just a clock time being the okay to get somebody licensed to be a teacher because they've taught 10 months here or something like that, or they're a teacher of record. What is that evaluation process is something I think would be important.
That's a good point. And I do want to emphasize that this is not for getting somebody their license. It is for advancing from your practitioner, your initial 3-year license, to your professional license, which is still a big milestone. You're going from 3-year approval to 6-year approval, but just clarifying.
Amy, this is Sarah. To that point, I mean, I think that was what I was going to frame up for discussion too, is that this is about advancement. And so for all of us, what is the point of advancement? What are we trying to mark essentially when we say you're moving from the practitioner to the professional? And, I think one of the big things is, this is a teacher who's going from sort of the novice category to what we would consider more of an experienced professional. And so I guess the question for all of us is, do we consider, teaching experience outside of Tennessee to be relevant for considering someone to be that experienced professional? I think there's arguments on both sides, but I think largely it seems to me that teaching experience is teaching experience. I think we have a number of things that are unique in Tennessee in terms of our expectations for our early career teachers, but I do think we've gotten so many different questions from, whether it's folks who are teaching abroad, as Amy mentioned, or in other states, who for various reasons, namely, we have a lot of bordering states in Tennessee, want to keep their Tennessee license active, and they also want to be, marked as the professional they consider themselves to be. So I just put that out there for discussion too. What is the point of moving from the practitioner to the professional, and how do we want to consider these things in light of that?
Yeah, I want to jump in, Bob. I thought your comment was a very good one, and I will say that in every case today, we have some sort of parameter by which we will accept the teaching experience. So let me just kind of quickly go through the primary pathways for experience. One is obviously experience in a pre-K-12 public school operated by an LEA in the United States or United States territories. That one's pretty obvious. Verified experience in a pre-K-12 public or non-public school approved by recognized accrediting agencies, and then there's a list of those agencies. Verified experience in a pre-K-12 public or non-public school approved by the Tennessee Department of Human Services, Tennessee Department of Corrections. So I won't go through all of these, but I think you get the point that there's some sort of a backstop where we say, well, there needs to be some verification that the experience was in this type of a setting.
That's very helpful, Michael. In fact, my question, and I think you just answered it, is there an evaluation process that each individual goes through to see if they've met the criteria, as opposed to just, something that says they have so many years of teaching?
Yeah.
So it's individual. You look at each individual then.
That's correct. Yeah. An out-of-country experience does count if it's approved or authorized by a foreign ministry of education or equivalent entity. So there is some work on our end. It's not just a blanket, oh, you said you taught and we'll take your word for it and here you go.
Well, and you have a paycheck. You have a paycheck to show it, you know. So I mean,
sure.
So that's the point. Is that there is a good evaluation process that looks at each one individually. So
yeah, now the early
Michael,
child. Yes, Mike.
This is Mike. I apologize for. I think I used the word. Is there a definition of it? What you just explained was getting to the question I was trying to make. So
Got
thanks.
it. Yeah, not a problem. Now in the early childhood space, the early childhood space, and now we're going to have this, well, we do have this endorsement that covers birth through kindergarten. That's one I am personally not super educated on the various settings that would cover and what sort of that backstop could be. If I'm allowed to, I might tag somebody like David Chiak, who's on this call, who actually brought this up during one of our working group sessions. David, sorry to put you on the spot, but I guarantee it's something that we could look to the field to and figure out what is that sort of backstop. I do know, oh, there he is, David. Hey, David. I do know that when we were working with our early childhood group to develop those two endorsements, I was informed that the state agency that oversees evaluation or ratings for those early childhood settings is likely going to prioritize things like licensure, but it may not be required. And that's where it gets a little tricky because if an agency, for example, like homeschooling doesn't require a license in Tennessee. So we can't count that. So that's been kind of our approach is if the setting requires a license, we'll accept it, but we may need to get a little creative with that for that birth through kindergarten endorsement.
David, feel free to unmute if you'd like to add anything in there. David Chiak is from UT Knoxville.
Thank you, and thank you, Michael, and all of y'all's help with this. Yes, this is one that we have raised. University of Tennessee Knoxville was one of the original pilots for the pre-KK program, which was a dual program, integrated license. So it was probably the predecessor of what we're seeing now for birth to kindergarten and integrated pre-K3 license. The challenge is it's really hard to be honest with students that want to go into the career who might teach at a Head Start, knowing that they're going to lose their license in 6 years, that they'll be able to renew it once, but that opportunity to renew it a second time in a non-public institution, a K-12 kind of space, becomes very difficult. And so we have just lost students over the years because it's difficult for us to, in good faith, advise them about a career path that may expire in 6 years. And of course, we raised it again with the new licensure that we're all very excited about. And so looking at some possibility for like Head Start, for example, I mean, that was initially our cohort of folks who were teaching and working in accredited Head Start programs. And so by looking at those kind of accredited early childhood settings, I would be a fan of supporting.
Thank you so much, David. That's super helpful.
It certainly is. And this is Lillian. And so as I read through this prior to the meeting today, my first thought was I really want to know what others are thinking with regard to this, because it's easy for me to think each of these are a good idea, or I'd like to know the pros and cons of each one of them. And so I think the working group and certainly our EPPs, getting your feedback is critically important to me, because you're the professional in this space, and we're volunteers. We all have opinions, but those are our opinions, and they may not be rooted or grounded in the right kind of information that would help us make an informed decision. So I appreciate being asked, because I'm inclined to say yes to all of them. That was my initial reaction when I read through them, but I also had a bit of reservation. What are the pros and cons of each of these? And that's just where my mind gravitates because I want to know what professionals who do this for a living think about this. And you know the repercussions of decisions that are made, the impact on people who may not be placed in a public school setting, as you said, David. They have to go to Head Start because that's what's available to them. So that's important information to get that kind of feedback.
And thank you. And sometimes it's the choice. They want to teach at a Head Start. You know, we know the importance of preschool, high quality preschool programs in kindergarten, and especially in literacy 1, 2, and 3. And, you know, even if a birth to kindergarten endorsement is going to expire after 6 years, it is hard for me to talk to parents and 18 and 19-year-olds who want to become teachers and work with early childhood to say that, yes, do it, but here's some of the consequences 6 years down the road.
Thank you for that clarification. And I said I was inclined to say yes to all of them. I'm inclined to say no to the first one and yes to the other two. That's my opinion. Thank you. Thank you for that.
So, Madam Chair, I appreciate that clarity. So your thought is similar to what Sarah said, that teaching experience is teaching experience, and that we may not need that 10-month in Tennessee requirement given people move, we've got military families, this kind of thing. Is that correct?
That is absolutely correct. Yes, thank you.
Do other members have any other thoughts on this slide before we move forward?
This is Bob Eby. David's comment was very helpful to me for understanding, you know, particular applications and, you know, certainly Head Start and preschool teachers, I think, need to be licensed and certified and to have the requirements, give them the impetus to stay in those positions, I think are important. I would just want to be sure that whatever we come up with have the appropriate controls that, you know, when we do elevate somebody from a, you know, to a professional license or something like that, that we know that they are the quality of what we want within the state of Tennessee. And I think that's from what I hear from David and all that happens, but this has been very helpful to me.
Well, we have one more fairly broad topic to cover, so I'll be interested in your thoughts on this one as well. This is about our required licensure assessments, which, as you know, are needed in many scenarios to get your license in the first place, to advance it, to reactivate it. And in all cases, our current language is that you must have scores on the required assessments that are no more than 5 years old. So if I needed to apply to reactivate my license this year, I needed to have taken that test no later than 2016. We've heard from a couple districts about folks who have had teachers who maybe decide to stay home with their kids for 6 or 7 years and then want to come back to the classroom, or they have some other reason that they have scores that are just past 5 years old. They're 6 years old, they're 7 years old, and that it's a challenge to ask folks to take the assessment again. Some people just say, I'm not gonna do it, I won't go back into teaching. And that obviously raised some concerns for us given our current teacher shortage. But we do want to balance that with the fact that we want to know, do you have current and relevant content knowledge? Are you prepared to step back into the classroom? So just wanted to open it up on your thoughts. Michael, you can help frame this, I think, a little bit with me, that one option would be to simply revisit this and put in a different amount of years, that it has to be no more than 6 years old, no more than some amount of years old. We could also say something like that it is valid as long as it is the currently required assessment that is the one currently listed in the professional assessments policy. Michael got us some data from ETS about our praxis assessments specifically and how old some of them are. So do you want to go into that a little bit, Michael?
Sure. So I had ETS send us kind of well, let me back up one step. So the Praxis series assessments are typically aligned to some set of national standards in that content area. They're likely the same set of standards that are required of educator preparation providers in developing the content of their programs. And when the organization that develops those standards revises those standards or goes through a process to revisit them, ETS, that is one case where ETS and other test vendors revisit their assessments because they know that those assessments could become out of alignment with or misaligned with the standards. So I reached out to ETS and said, well, can you send us a spreadsheet? And I just got this late last week, but a spreadsheet of all of our currently required assessments and the date that they were last regenerated, recognizing that some of the standards haven't been revised in maybe 10 years. And that they're kind of all over the board, to be honest. There's just a few that the last revised date or when those tests were introduced was back either at the end of 2010. There's only 3 in that boat, and then some in 2011, a greater proportion in 2012, 2013, and then it increases. So quite a few were introduced in 2014. So we're talking about 6 or 7 years ago, really. So, you know, that's one thing to consider as far as is 5 a magic number? Is there a magic number, or could it simply just be that they submit qualifying scores on the test that is required at the point of application, regardless of how old that assessment score may be?
Michael, is there any data that would help us? Has anyone studied this before to make a determination if there's a magic number? If teachers who've stayed out of the profession for 6 years or 7 or 10 or whatever, and then come back into the fold, if other states perhaps that have had less restrictive numbers of years, and we may not consider ours restrictive, but it could be to a host of other people. So is it possible that there is some data out there that would help inform our decision? Because I think at the end of the day, when we think about this, it has to do with, is the teacher's knowledge still relevant? Is it still effective to be able to put them back into the classroom after being away from a certain amount of time? That's what I think about.
Good question. Not that I know of, but I will also say that there are many instances of that not greater than 5 years old language throughout state board rule and policy, and it's not always a reactivation. So I know Amy mentioned some of the pending legislation that would impact this, but even when folks are coming to Tennessee, they may have been actively teaching, but took the assessment 8-10 years ago. So they may not have been out of the classroom at all. And so it's a really mixed bag. We may even have folks who just let their license expire last year. And the board policy or rule is very clear. They must, in order to reactivate, you must submit qualifying scores on required assessments that are no more than 5 years old. And so it's a tough thing to pin down. I think more often than not, though, folks just don't have all of, you know, especially folks coming from out of state may not have the exact slate of assessments that are required in Tennessee. They may have some combination of them. That may also be true for people that are reactivating their license because of the timing in which they took their test to get a license. So it's a bit mixed and would be probably a hard thing to really assess.
Well, this is Mike.
Go ahead,
One
Mike.
of the things Amy said earlier was that one of the problems with this is that people may look at this having to retake it and just say they don't want to teach because it's just too onerous. Do we have any sense of the order of magnitude of that? Is that a small number, a great number, a significant? What do we know about that?
It's really anecdotal. I don't know if you have anything, Michael. I've had, you know, over the years, probably 10 districts bring this up, but in different circumstances. It'll be a teacher here, a teacher there, or it'll be, well, we have this handful of people. Sometimes it just hits a district in 1 year. They get a wave of these things. I don't have a way to track it. I don't know if you do, Michael.
We don't, and I would kind of agree with your assessment that it's anecdotal. There's one here, one there. We hear more about the out-of-state issue than anything.
All right. Thank you.
This is Bob. I think what Michael says about it being a mixed bag is I think we're getting feedback, is right on, because I think about somebody who's been teaching in another state on a regular basis versus somebody that hasn't been in the classroom at all for 7 years. I know we do a standards review, what, every 6 years, I think, or something like that. And so if they've been out of the classroom for 7 years and to say they would come in and we're going to give them a license and there's no evaluation, or they haven't been keeping their professional certification hours up during that time, that gives me concern. But if somebody's been in another state teaching, and they're coming to teach the same thing that they were teaching before, basically just in the state, then the differences between what's in those state standards and our state standards probably isn't that much different, that they can't pick that up with some, study and training, et cetera. So I think it is a mixed bag, and how you get through that mixed bag and make a decision, or make a carte blanche decision, I think it's something that needs to look at and see how we can address each one of these issues or something.
If I could tag on, that's just where my head was going too, Bob, is that I think maybe one next step that would be helpful is to list out, like you said, Michael, where in our policies and rules do we have this 5-year sort of requirement in terms of, retesting, and then we can determine together, is this an area where it makes sense? You've been out of the classroom for 10 plus years, period, from all state scenarios, or you've been in another state and you've been actively teaching. I mean, there may be some nuance that we want to consider before we kind of go, completely one way or the other in terms of keeping this as a requirement as part of the licensure process in some cases.
We could definitely put that kind of list together. Michael, is there anything you'd want us to be aware of on the front end in terms of licensure processing needs or speed, or how those things could be affected?
I think we'd have to consider that. I mean, I also think that if legislation passes that could impact this, that will play a huge role in this conversation. The other group that we didn't mention that has been kind of a bit of a challenge are people who meet all the requirements to renew their license and don't submit an application to do so. And so their license expires, and technically the language says you got to retake tests. We've had sort of a grace period, a brief grace period, to say, well, if you met the requirements but simply didn't submit an application, you can submit an application. That's a challenge to manage. And so I wonder if there's a conversation that needs to happen around that group as well. I do recall in the previous policy many years ago, folks like that just had to meet the renewal requirements at any point in time, but then the board kind of took that stance and said, well, we need to verify that you still have the content knowledge. And so that's kind of why we are where we are at the moment.
Yeah, that's helpful to be reminded about, Michael, because you're right. Like I said, there really is a lot of nuance across these different scenarios where someone might be asked to take that test again. So, well, as I said at the beginning of the meeting, I think this group will be coming back together in the not so distant future. So maybe this is one we can come back to and revisit in terms of a little bit more of the nuance now that we've kind of got a foundation of understanding of this issue, and then make some determinations from there.
Yeah, no, it is super helpful for us because we had been taking, the 5 years has been our gold standard for quite some time now. So this was the initial, does it pass the smell test for the board members? Is this something that's worth spending more time and going back and looking into? Or if you had said, no, absolutely, 5 years is by far the most we would extend, why isn't it 3 years? I think that would have also been a helpful, we just need to kind of know which direction to go in on these kinds of things.
I think the other part is what I believe Mike Edwards says, and it has to do with how often is this happening? The number of people who are who put themselves in this situation, if you will. So are those numbers large? And I believe you said that there's one here and there, Michael, if I heard you correctly, because I'm having technical problems with my computer, and every time I take myself off of mute, you all are getting a lot of background noise. And so I've had to turn the volume really low, and I'm struggling to hear some responses. So if I'm stated that incorrectly, please correct me by all means. Yes, so would you clarify that for me? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that conversation was around how many folks end up leaving the profession as a result of this requirement. And anecdotally, that's a tough thing to measure. But anecdotally, it's a person here and there. We've heard more challenges around the out-of-state assessment requirements, and the board did get rid of the initial level out-of-state requirement for assessments. They still do have to pass it prior to renewing or advancing the license. So that did relieve some of that burden. But otherwise, you know, we can probably look at reactivation applications. Just what's the frequency of folks who are reactivating their license? Because those folks, by definition, would have to take and pass the required assessments, or just demonstrate that they had taken them within the last 5 years.
Michael, I also wonder if this is something, I believe y'all have a group of HR directors that you meet with sometimes. Is that right?
That's
For
correct.
districts?
Yeah.
I wonder if it would be worth asking them what's been their experience, how many times have they had someone express interest, and then when they learn about the requirements, just sort of throw their hands up and say, I'm not spending another couple $100 on assessments, I'm out.
Yeah, good point.
Because we would never know about those people at the state level unless the districts tell us.
Yep.
Great, thank you. Right.
Yeah, and to my point, having that data, having that information that will inform the decision that is made, and a recommendation that you would provide to us, because I could see us adding some flexibility under certain parameters, but I certainly want experts to tell us, people who I would consider themselves more of an expert than I am when it comes to the impact, the adverse impact to making the decision to extend the validity period, or to specifying, as you said in the last part of that discussion question, as long as it is the currently required assessment. I'm open-minded to that, and I may be the lone person in that regard. So gathering information that will help us make a better decision in the future would be helpful. Thank you.
Any other comments? We have one more specific topic that I know you want to discuss as well, Madam Chair. Our final topic is about specifically the physical education PE endorsement. This is something that you, Madam Chair, flagged for us, hearing from an ed prep in your area. Vice Chair Eby also sent us some thoughts and communications he'd had about this. So first going to present the lay of the land, and then some options that staff have thought of, and then interested to hear your thoughts and some direction for our staff. So we've heard from several EPPs who've reached out directly to board members to share concerns that there are low numbers of their candidates obtaining the PE endorsement in recent years. And this comes at a time when, due to the Tom Cronin Physical Education Act of 2018, districts are required to have educators who hold the PE endorsement or who have an undergraduate degree in the field to teach elementary PE. That's as opposed to the practice of simply having your classroom teacher take the students to the gym or the field and do activities for physical education. So we have fewer people being prepared, but we're going to have more people who need the endorsement. On our next slide, we have some data to share with you. Erica can give us the appropriate caveats. I'll give you an overview and she can give you more details. Educators seeking this endorsement are required to pass the Praxis exam PE Content and Design with a score of 169 or higher. Erica, if you don't mind hitting the next 2 bullet points, I'd really appreciate it.
Okay, so the pass rate that is shown in this table here is based on educators who are included in the most recent teacher preparation report card. So that's candidates who completed their preparation between 2016 and 2019. We had in that group 402 candidates who took the PE Content and Design assessment, and the pass rate was approximately 76%. The way that we calculate the pass rate for the report card is within 2 attempts. So if you passed on your first or second attempt, you're counted as passing. But if you needed more than 2 attempts to pass, even if you did eventually pass, you're counted as not passing for this purpose. So we also looked to see if there were differences in different racial and ethnic groups in pass rates for this exam. And we did notice that this was one of the exams with a pretty large gap in pass rates between white and non-white test takers, nearly 20% difference. And also I should point out that these pass rates, because they are from candidates who actually did get a license, this is probably skewing high. So this would not count, this pass rate doesn't include people who dropped out of their licensure program because they couldn't pass the exam, for example.
Thank you so much. This also, as Erica mentioned, is looking at folks who are getting their initial license and who are seeking the PE endorsement as part of that. It would not capture somebody who had been teaching elementary ed or anything else and then went to take PE as an add-on endorsement. So this is just the folks who were in that initial licensure cohort for the report card. So those are all the appropriate caveats. We do always want to be cautious that you have all possible information when looking at data, especially when we do see this pretty great disparity, as Erica noted. So thinking about that, oops, I think I magnified rather than advancing. There we go. These are a few ideas that our staff have generated, but very interested in your discussion. Some things we could look at here would be to review the cut score on the current assessment and think about what's the rationale for having it at its current threshold. Is that an appropriate bar to expect folks to meet? We could, as we have done in other subject areas, consider whether different assessment vendors offer different licensure assessments. We do this in secondary math, where someone could take the Praxis from ETS or the Pearson NES series. We had compared those to say, you have to know a whole lot of math to pass either of them. They could both be appropriate. We could investigate that kind of thing for PE as well. And finally, we could look at our EPP standards for the PE specialty area program to say, is there something about our preparation expectations that is not best serving candidates here? There's also a stipulation in the specialty area program standards that says, Michael, you say this better than I do. It's about the content major requirements for this field. Can you pick that one up?
Sure. So the literacy and specialty area standards policy indicates that programs must lead to a major in physical education. We have heard from some programs that are trying to design programs or have programs on campus that are exercise science majors. And some folks have tried to create a better combination of an exercise science program with an education program. And so right now the policy kind of prohibits that the way that it's written. Also, Amy, if it's an appropriate time, I'm happy to jump in and just give some context behind conversations I've had with internally.
Sure.
So I did reach out last week to our physical education, physical activity coordinator, and we've had a few conversations on this. Her first glance at the Pearson test, the one concern there was that it was 100% multiple choice. The Praxis exam does have a writing component. But I did have to kind of make clear to her that these folks still have to complete the EdTPA as well. So I think we're kind of in the middle of a conversation about these assessments. And then second to that, she said she'd be interested in talking a little bit more about the issue that I just raised regarding majors and whether there are any other majors that colleges and universities have that might be appropriate for this purpose. So we are kind of just starting to have some of these conversations. We have yet to kind of reach out broadly to the EPP community, especially those that offer these programs, to see kind of what their thinking is right now, but we certainly can do that.
How do these strike you? Lillian, I know that you had specifically heard this concern. Does this feel like it's on the right track for exploring how to solve for this challenge?
Amy, it certainly does sound like we're on the right track, and I would definitely want to hear from EPPs to provide any other input that they want to share with us. I know that Bob Eby has spoken to several EPPs and has received information. I have stellar students who are knocking it out of the park in residency, doing a phenomenal job in front of students, and actually conducting and teaching PE classes. And so and missing praxis by 1 point. And those kinds of things are hugely disappointing. And there's one student in particular that stands out who is just passionate about what his path is in life. And I actually had a chance to meet him last night at a dinner with students at Tennessee Tech. So you see these human beings who are being affected by this. By the same token, we have a duty and a responsibility to ensure that we're putting the best and the brightest in front of our students. And I believe in some instances we're probably missing the mark, in particular when you meet individuals who, as you hear from an EPP, I'd go to the end of the moon for this person. I would do anything and everything that I possibly could to ensure that this person receives his endorsement. And so those kinds of things resonate with me personally. And when you look at the numbers, you look at the data, and this is a student of color, by the way, you find yourself saying you want to find a solution. And so in conversation with Dr. Morrison, I said, let's do everything in our power to investigate this, look into it, and find out where we have opportunities to change this. So that's where I'm coming from, and I'm not alone in this. I know there are many EPPs that have had similar situations, and I'll stop because I think, Bob, you wanted to add perhaps a couple of comments.
Yes, Lloyd. Let me ask one question first. I think on the slide before, it says that they either pass the practice exam or they have a degree in PE. So if they have a degree in PE, they don't have to pass the practice exam and they can be a licensed teacher. Is that?
That is specifically to meet the requirements of the Tom Cronin Physical Education Act.
Mm-hmm.
So this would be a scenario where somebody has a teaching license with an endorsement in another area, for example, elementary education.
Sure.
But that person happened to have an undergraduate degree in PE. I'm not quite sure how that would happen, but let's just say it does. If that person with their undergrad degree in PE was instructing the elementary PE class, they would meet the requirements of the law. So this is not saying that just having a major doesn't get them the PE endorsement, doesn't get them their teaching license. It's only to meet the requirements of the Cronin Act.
Okay, so here's a couple of questions and comments I have. I have gotten feedback from actually EPPs across the state as well as some districts across the state. And the numbers, the data that Erica presented, the data that I've seen actually for 2020, you have 2016 and 2019. 2020 is even worse, but it may not be the first time people just coming out of school. It may be that it may be people who've been teaching elementary ed or something and have decided to get a PE endorsement and decided to take the test or whatever. But the percentage that are not passing the praxis is even quite a bit smaller and certainly much more disparity than the data that you're presenting. So it clearly shows that we have a problem, but I'm very pleased to see that we're not looking at taking, removing the Tom Cronin Act and what it requires. And I think that's really important. Tennessee's #1 in the nation in childhood obesity and physical education lack thereof. And I think it's important for us to, when we pass that, to maintain that. But that being said, I think what I hear, or what I would like to look at, is if a person has a PE degree, and I'm hearing that one reason they're not passing the test to get the license is a lot of them are really hurting on the writing exams. And I've heard, again, this is anecdotal, but I heard that Memphis district, Shelby County District, really spends a lot of time and effort helping their PE students with the writing so that when they do take it, that they can pass it. And kudos to them if that's the right information. But if they have a PE degree from a university and maybe they haven't passed the the praxis or the licensure exams, is there a, can we, give a temporary degree license or something like that to allow them to teach PE while they work toward their overcoming their deficiencies? That's one possibility to look at.
Michael, that would fall under the category of a permit, correct?
Yes, and we cannot issue permits because of the Tom Cronin Act. We cannot issue permits for elementary PE.
Even if they have a PE degree, you can't.
That's my understanding. They have to hold the endorsement.
So, Michael, just to clarify, because in the permitting process, I'm issued a permit so that I can teach while I'm still in my ed prep program, waiting to complete it, to take praxis to get my endorsement. Is that not correct?
Not always true. I mean, that is one group of folks who could potentially be hired on a permit if it's a post-bac program. However, permits are for anyone who is unlicensed after the district has demonstrated that they tried to recruit a licensed educator. Now,
Right.
employment standards waivers or endorsement exemptions, I think they're called, that would be to allow a licensed educator to teach more than 2 sections of a course outside of their area of endorsement. We can't do that for early child or elementary PE either.
But what we might do is not provide permits for people who don't have PE endorsements unless they have a PE degree. That might be an exception, and we're looking at exceptions on other things. Could that not be an exception if they had a PE degree and didn't have the endorsement, that at least for near term we could provide that, and that would assure that the person understands or has, from an EPP, a baccalaureate degree in physical education. That's different than just, an algebra teacher teaching PE.
Bob, we'd have to we need to go back and check with legal. My understanding was the same as Michael's, that you can't have, that it was specifically said in the Cronin Act that it cannot be somebody on a permit or one of these temporary credentials. What it does allow is if I have my license and endorsement in another field, so I'm an active teacher, and I also have this undergraduate degree in PE, then I meet the requirements of the Cronin Act. It's not giving me the endorsement. It's not giving me a license where I didn't have one. It's just saying, it's not even really about the individual. It's more about, is the district meeting compliance with the law? Does that make sense? So we can go back to legal and figure out more specifically if there's any workarounds here, but my understanding has been that there are not.
Yeah, I'd like to understand that and look at that as a possibility. But I do think that we need to work with the EPPs and identify why is it that the pass rate is so low, and maybe it is changing the exams to a different kind of exam or something like that. But why is the pass rate so low? Because it is considerably lower, at least the data that I'm looking at for 2020 compared to any of the other endorsements. And so what can we do to build that up, I think, is something we ought to look at.
I think that's a good point. One thing that I think we can do is I can certainly see if ETS has any more granular data within the assessment and various, if there are any sort of sub scores or things like that, where are folks struggling, that, then may result in a conversation, kind of a backwards mapping conversation about what's happening or not happening in preparation programs to support candidates in that specific area. But we have a lot of providers that offer programs leading to PE. So I think there's 26 across the state of our 40. So I think, again, reaching out to our EPP community to get their, a sense from them of where folks are struggling and why that might be the case could be valuable as well.
I think that's a great idea, Michael.
This is Mike. kind of an embarrassing question, but is there some EPPs who have a significant higher pass rate than others, or the reverse? Could it be programs?
I don't know that off the top of my head, but that's a great question that we can look into. Erica,
You know,
did
one of the
you do that
things-
analysis?
I haven't done that yet, but that was actually on my list of upcoming research projects, was to look at differences, not just for the PE exam, but for various licensure exams, to look at which EPPs are doing really well, particularly for candidates of color.
Michael, this is Donna Neblett. If I could interject just a moment, what we did is we had 3 of the faculty members in the Health and Human Performance Department take the PE praxis themselves. And what they found was they desperately needed to adjust their curriculum. Now, we don't know outcomes yet, but they went back and not only adjusted their curriculums, but also added workshops to make sure they had covered the material that they expected their students to see.
Thank you so much, Donna. That's really helpful. Donna's at UT Martin, and that's a great idea. And we can certainly facilitate identifying programs, as Erica said, with, you know, especially high pass rates, and then being able to share out some of those best practices. This is going to be a great topic of discussion, I know, with our TACTI folks. I'm so glad we have your involvement in this one.
So I think in looking at that type of information, which I think is important to do when you have students that are getting ready to graduate and they're in this limbo situation where they're not going to get their endorsement because they're missing, as I said in this one example, they're missing it by 1 point. But like I said, hitting it out of the park, 4.0 GPA, performance is exceeding all expectations in the classroom. We have to have a solution for those kinds of situations. And so I look forward to all of the data, all of the information that can help inform the decision as we think about those who are ready to graduate and how do we address that situation, because we do have a shortage of PE teachers. And I think that was the original reason why the Tom Cronin Act was delayed in implementation. So I think coming up with those solutions are critically important sooner than later. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Madam Chair, that would move on to our last topic. We can certainly move on, but I didn't know if you wanted a break or anything else beforehand.
It's fine to move forward as far as I'm concerned,
Let's see.
unless anyone has an objection.
Are we going to talk about the endorsement pathways?
That's it right now, Mike.
Okey doke.
All right.
I thought we were going to, oh, I got it wrong. All right. I apologize.
Sarah, do you want to start us off here?
I'm happy to. This is a follow-up from the conversation the board had at our last quarterly meeting with our partners at the department around the idea of a new pathway for adding endorsements. This would be for teachers who already have an existing license who would be adding an additional endorsement. And I don't want to speak for the department, but trying to solve for the case where we've got a lot of long-term substitutes across the state filling in important areas where we would ideally have certified licensed teachers with the proper endorsement. And so we had a lot of questions, and we've shared those questions with the department that many of you on the subcommittee provided in terms of just trying to consolidate the questions and discussion points moving forward before this would come back on first reading in May, I think is our timeline now. But I really think Lillian, Bob, Mike, the questions that you all shared with us, I don't want to speak for you, so it's probably good to go ahead and start that discussion with those questions or others that may have come up for you since then, and we can begin to kind of generate some next steps based on that conversation. It looks like we've got staff just joining us too. So,
Sarah, so before we do that, I have a basic opening question for the department with regard to the input, the feedback that was provided. And I know Amy compiled that for us and sent it to the TDOE team. So I'm interested first and foremost in knowing, do they have questions for us regarding the feedback that we provided? Anything in particular that stood out to them, and any concerns or follow-up questions that they may have for us before we dive in and start speaking to each one of them? That's where my brain is at this time. And I just want to know if they can do that for us.
Certainly, and this is Jack Powers at the Department of Education. I just first and foremost want to say thank you, Dr. Morrison. Thank you, Chairman Hartgrove. Thank you to the board staff for inviting Michael and I back to just kind of continue to hear discussion on this item. We heard when we brought this in February the great passion and interest and care that board members paid to this topic, and I just want to say that you know, the call to us to kind of really slow down and really be thoughtful and consider how we're going about this was heard loud and clear. And I think today is going to be another good chance for us to continue to hear that feedback, take note of it, and continue to kind of ruminate on the questions you've posed as we continue to work on the item. In particular, the questions that we have received, yes, we have received them. I think they've been really helpful in helping us kind of think about the way that we're going about constructing the program. I don't know if we have any specific, feedback or questions that those prompted. I do know that we're continuing to kind of examine them and just take them into the planning consideration.
Thank you for that, Jack. So with that being said, we can, I think, jump in and begin the discussion. If it would be helpful to you all that we either restate or reemphasize the things that have been shared and any other questions or comments that our members have. And I believe I heard someone trying to speak.
Madam Chair, this is Bob.
Yes, go ahead, Bob. Go ahead, Bob.
Okay, so kind of following up on Jack's comment, I'm certainly delighted to hear that the board is, that the TDOE is looking at the questions that we send and carefully evaluating them. One thing that we talked about at our board meeting was the importance of stakeholder engagement. And I was curious because I know, like I say, I've heard from several EPPs who obviously have an interest in whatever decision is made with respect to the licensure pathway. Have you engaged them in this process, or where do we stand in the stakeholder engagement process?
Certainly, that's a great question. What I'll start with is first and foremost districts. I think it was mentioned by Dr. Morrison that one of the thrusts for this pathway in the first place is the need to fill teacher shortage, and that has kind of been the impetus for us pursuing this pathway, and that was driven first and foremost by stakeholder feedback at the district level. I can also say that David and the human capital team has been in conversation with various different folks across the state at the EPP level. I know that several of the questions posed to date concern exactly how this would interact with the EPPs and the fact that there are endorsement pathways that exist through them. And so what I can say is that conversations with the EPPs are ongoing, but the short answer is yes, sir. We are engaging with the EPP community. I'll say this, I think we're actively looking to, in making sure that this pathway is high quality, borrow best practices from some of the successful programs around the state to make sure that we do this the correct way.
I'll just add to Jack. We held our last educator preparation working group meeting, I want to say last month, and I don't remember if it was earlier this month or at some point last month because time is a challenging thing these days. But we held our last EPWG meeting, and this was a point of conversation. And I think, just a reminder, that group is made up of 20 folks who represent both EPPs and LEAs. And so it was a really, I think, robust conversation because we kind of had both perspectives. I think front of mind is the fact that everybody wants the same thing, not just to fill vacancies either, but also to ensure that whatever options are available for educators, either to get their initial license in a specific field or get an additional endorsement in a field, that those options are of high quality and grounded in some very clear parameters and expectations. And so that was a big part of the conversation. And then otherwise, I think many of the questions that you all have raised, those were also raised by the Educator Preparation Working Group. So it seems like the sort of themes that are coming out of all of our conversations are very similar. And so as Jack noted, I think these are all really good things for us to dig deep into as we're refining our recommendation.
Thank you to both of you.
A follow-up question regarding the particular endorsements. I believe at the board meeting, you had indicated that you were looking at special education and I believe ELL. Correct me if I'm wrong, please. So I just want to clarify that, and that you would start out with perhaps 2 endorsements, maybe 3. Could you clarify that for us?
Certainly. I think that, like I mentioned previously, this is all driven by shortage area. So when you look at it that way, those are certainly 2 subject areas where we have a dire teacher shortage. So I know that on that fact alone, those would be 2 subject areas we're interested in. With that being said, given that this is driven by teacher shortage, I want to just note that we're still actively considering exactly the scope of this. Again, making sure that what we provide is going to actually fill a need, and that will be driven by teacher shortage data and where we ultimately land on as the greatest need.
To follow up on that comment about teacher shortage data, again, we have a lot of anecdotal data on vacancy, but it's nothing official and nothing from the department. For us to be able to make decisions that we have to make, that data would be very important. Is that something that you can provide to us as the data that you're showing with regard to the vacancy data across the state?
That's a great question. I will tentatively say I believe the answer is yes. I know that this past October was a big milestone in that it was the first time that the department really collected that data at the state level with the level of detail that I believe we have. I think it's a really important step to make sure we can describe this issue prior, touching on some of the discussion on other items. A lot of it has been anecdotal, but this was the first time we kind of have had a coordinated effort through district HR departments to tell exactly where the shortage areas are. So I will go back and take that to our program team and find out at what level we can kind of collate that to make sure that we get a good picture of it for board members.
Perfect, thanks.
Oh, another follow-up, Jack, just so with regard to the idea that we're tapping into teachers who currently hold an endorsement and would perhaps consider a SPED like endorsement. Do we have information from the LEAs that indicate there is a strong desire to take on a special education endorsement or a different endorsement, if you will? Do we have that kind of information that really supports this notion, this idea? So just curious to know that.
Sure. That's a great question. I honestly don't know the answer to that one. I would be happy to take that back to our program teams as well. Just to clarify, you're asking if we have any sort of teacher voice data, if you will, to suggest that teachers who are currently endorsed have a willingness or a want to take on an additional endorsement. I can certainly filter that question back. And, one of the things I'll say just related to special education and being a former teacher myself, I certainly don't want to speak for any teachers in the state, but the tenets of special education can reach throughout multiple disciplines, right? I mean, when we talk about special education, we're talking about a wide variety of needs that students have. And I'll say this, as a former teacher, I would have welcomed the chance to learn more about that space simply because it would have helped me in a lot of different areas, including making sure I adequately, fulfilled the needs of some of the students I have with IEPs, that I could effectively, differentiate instruction, things of that nature. So again, I don't want to speak for teachers in the state, but I expect that that many of them would welcome the chance.
I would.
So with that being said, again, another follow-up to that follow-up question, I think it would be hugely beneficial to have that information. I suspect that you're probably right, but as you get ready to launch this new pathway, I think, and the amount of work that has to go into preparing for any one of these possible endorsements, developing it, that it would be important to have that information to know if it's truly beneficial to go down this path.
So I would say one other kind of related thing. Through our special education additional endorsement grant, we've had some significant interest in that. We currently have over 160 participants who are seeking additional endorsement in special education, which is getting paid for. We have districts that are willing to pay for the praxis exams if folks pursue these pathways. And then we have had broad support from kind of the district and school-based stakeholder groups across the state for this proposal. So I think there are some indicators that there is demand and desire to have folks get an additional endorsement, and not necessarily, I think Jack kind of touched on this, not necessarily to go right into a special education classroom either, but to support their ability to work with all students in their current setting as well.
I do have one more follow-up, and I think Mike is trying to talk, so I apologize for this. We have heard concerns about special education in particular being part of this new pathway, given the unique situation that educators are in when they are in front of students with special needs. I think overcoming that concern, that you can do justice to preparing a teacher who's not had prior experience in that space to be able to do it effectively in an online program. So if you all could just speak to that, I think that would be helpful.
Absolutely. And, again, I'll echo just my thanks and our thanks that you all are so tapped in. And you certainly raise a good point. I mean, we're talking about a vulnerable group of students. One of the things I want to make sure that I highlight here is that when we talk about developing the pathway and the proposal on our side, as the department, the staff members who are tasked with doing that full time, I would be remiss if I didn't mention their experience both as special educators and as school leaders in successful schools that have run recognized and awarded special education programs. She's not with us today, but Amy Galloway, who's on our human capital team, is one of the staff members working on this proposal. And so I think it's important to mention when we're talking about quality that that content knowledge in that area and experience in that area is something that we think is critical to making sure that whatever we do propose is of high quality.
Jack,
Thank you, Jack.
Just kind of to briefly build on that too, in my conversations with Amy as well, they're really grounded in the same sets of standards that EPPs ground their programs in. And as we survey and think about EPP offerings for additional endorsements, many of them are online as well. And so there are kind of a diverse set of pathways by which somebody can seek a special education endorsement, all pretty much grounded in the same sets of standards, the Council for the Exceptional Children standards. So that is kind of the basis and the foundation for the preparation across the board.
I yield some more time to take it away from me. Mike, I believe you were trying to speak. Mike Edwards.
Yeah, thank you. So, Jack, or whoever, I'm going to sort of state the obvious. I think Sarah said earlier, we've had this committee for 6 years. When it was put together, it was basically waiting into the world of EPPs for first time, and then with the intent of being serious about it. And I think we have been. And I think we've done it with very good intentions. I think we've done it with fidelity. And I hope that they believe that we've made it better. But it has changed the way they had to get out of their comfort zone. Many of them did, and that wasn't necessarily pleasant for everybody. To go around this a long way. The truth is, we've got a lot vested in teacher prep. So one of the things that concern me personally is that once the board has drifted off in different directions and populated with new people over a matter of however many, 10 years or whatever, once you guys are gone, we really need to make sure that the documents, the policies, and everything that governs this is going to allow the same accountability, require the same accountability of the department as really a new EPP technically, as is held to the other people. And so when we're looking, when Mike Edwards is looking at what to vote on, what I'm going to try to do is look at what the proposal is side by side with what we require of an EPP. And that's, so you guys need to think about, when you talk about faculty, you talk about qualifications, and I know I've heard you saying this, but you're really going to it's best to write it down as though someone's going to pick it up on Mars and know exactly what it's saying, because one day the folks who have crafted this and folks who have voted on this are going to not be there, and they're going to rely totally on the document. So, for example, guidance. I think we need, if we were to go down the road on guidance, we need to be clear as to whether it's guidance light or guidance comprehensive or both, everything. Anything we're talking about, because just put yourself in our heads and what we're going to be, such as, I don't know if that's a good idea, but you're going to have to, what are we going to have to know and hear from you guys to say, okay, this is rock solid, we're ready to go. The other thing is, and this is just something that as a back door, I would encourage to find out clearly when you're looking at a subject matter based on a shortage, and I'd want to know what the capacity was in the existing EPPs and the willingness to take on that before I think the state ought to take it on. And if the capacity and the willingness is there, I think real hard about getting into it. If it's not there, or if regionally it needs to be addressed from certain areas of the state that is just not going to have a feeder, then, that argues to do it. So I apologize for the meandering, but I'd kind of hope that we would have started to see stuff by now, from February, because I've been kind of wondering what's going on. I would encourage you to get us the written proposal well in advance of the May meeting. So there's probably going to be some back and forth in some language. The end.
Yes, sir. Thank you. First of all, thank you for sharing all of those points, and I hear you loud and clear. I've been taking some furious notes as you've been speaking. I want to touch just on a couple of things, if I can, just a couple of the kind of items that you raised. I think, first and foremost, I want to address the question of like EPP capacity and just the question of whether, I think, you touched on whether this should be the state's role or EPP's role or anyone else's role. And I just want to say, I think, we are firmly of the belief that to address teacher shortage and to ensure that we have high quality educators in front of all of our students, it will take effort on all sides. And by saying that, I certainly do not mean that our EPPs are not already making moves to address teacher shortage in effective ways. That is not what we are saying. I think what we are saying is that in order for this to work and in order for us to truly move the needle, it will take a village, if you will. And so that is kind of what we're trying to do. There's not a willingness here to replace and supplant. It's to kind of work alongside with in order to craft creative solutions to something that frankly affects a lot of other states. And so that's the first point I wanted to make. In terms of just making sure that there's kind of a historic record, I think I heard you talk about that too, ensuring that this is something that can function in perpetuity. I may be biased because I picked up the annual reports work for one cycle from Michael, but that is definitely something that's on the forefront of our mind in any of the work that we do at the department. And I think we have a lot of really good, internal assurances to make sure in terms of documentation. The what happens if I just disappear one day type documentations, we've definitely got that covered and think about that too. So I want to make a note of that. The other thing I wanted to say is, touching on this notion of, whether or not just touching on the accountability aspect of it. I just want to say, I don't think we're shying away from accountability at all. I do think it's important to mention that we are seeking to approval to provide additional endorsements, and Michael may chime in and say this more effectively than I can. I do want to make the distinction between that and becoming a fully fledged EPP to recommend candidates for additional licensure. Although I hear you loud and clear, and I understand what you're saying there about ensuring that what we craft here is just as effective as what a teacher preparation program would. But I did want to touch on that, just that distinction in terms of additional endorsements versus initial licensure and endorsements.
So,
Michael,
Jack, here's what you just said with specifics is what I was trying to describe needs to be on the agenda resolution in May. It wasn't on the agenda. That was not what we were reading in February. So the difference in what you were explaining and what I was left to vote on, which was a lot less than that, that's the difference. So you're there. You're on it.
Follow-up question, Jack, with regard to when we can expect to receive the next iteration of what you're going to propose to us. I know we typically get information a couple of weeks before the board meeting so that we can be prepared and ready to ask all the appropriate questions during the board meeting. But do you have any indication of an earlier window of providing the information to us, if at all possible?
Chairman, I don't right now. I would have to follow back up with that. I'm happy to do so.
Okay, but you do expect to have it to us within the 2 weeks out from the board meeting?
Yes, ma'am. I would imagine that the item will be submitted on time.
Okay. With regard to, I know we talked about accountability and then the outcomes of the results. So the candidate pool, they're taking these courses, they're enrolled, and then they're completing or they're not completing. What type of information are you all thinking about reporting to us so that we can see the effectiveness of and the success rate of the program, if you will?
That's a really good question. That's something I think that we're still really exploring. And I'll say just on, considering, like I mentioned, that this is kind of, when you talk about accountability for a different endorsement program, it's a little different than the way that we currently do EPP accountability. As you know, we don't get into that granular level on the state report card or on the annual reports. With that being said, as I mentioned, we don't want to shy away from accountability. So I can't really give you super specific, indicators that we're talking about looking at necessarily, but I can tell you that is something we're considering. And one of the things that I want to make sure I mention related to all these questions and specifics, I know that I heard a clear request to get the proposal submitted definitely on time, but if possible earlier. We're certainly open to participating at the workshop before that meeting to kind of delve into this in detail then. I think that's absolutely something that we are interested in exploring. So I just wanted to make sure I mentioned that as well.
Well, I'm glad you said that because I think lessons were learned on the part of us as well as perhaps on your side too, that we would want to have as much advanced information and opportunity to interact with you all to make sure that by the time it comes to us at the meeting, that there aren't any surprises on either side. And I think that's just smart for all of us to take that into consideration. So thank you.
Madam Chair, this is Bob Eby.
Yes, Bob.
Since the other two board members, you and Mike have mentioned it, I just want to say it also is I was meeting with a constituent not long ago, and they asked me what I thought were the most critical challenges that we had on the state board. And I said, top two are teacher shortages and the impact of COVID on the student education. And, I'm delighted that you're looking at this comprehensively. I'm delighted that you're, taking time to do this. But, we're being asked to pass rules which are going to have an impact to all the students across the state. And I can't speak for the other board members, but I think we saw at the last meeting that, we want to have time to be able to understand and ask questions. So being a part of workshops, working collaboratively with the department, collaboratively with the districts, with EPPs, so that when we get there at the board meeting, because I know one thing, when we tabled this, we talked about, what was the timeline that we needed to be able to impact the fall year. And I guess I thought we were having something in April, but now it's May. But I was assured that we would have plenty of time to do that. I want to be sure that we have time for questions, answers, discussions, that we don't, as the chair says, come at the board meeting and we end up where we were. So it's just really critical that we work together and get that information so that there's no real surprises when we come to the meeting. That's all I'll say. Thanks.
Absolutely.
Just jumping in on that, I mentioned this before, Jack, but just in terms of as we're thinking about this, I do think we're likely to have another subcommittee, and I don't want to get ahead of Eric and Amy on this, potentially in conjunction with the new literacy subcommittee sometime near the end of April. So after our special called meeting, but ahead of the May quarterly meeting. And again, that may be a good opportunity to come back on this ahead of the workshop. I think the workshop will be an important time, right there as part of the meeting for all of our board members. But I do think this subset of our board in particular, obviously, is even further invested in this item and trying to understand and kind of discuss, as members have spoken to already. So anyway, just one other thing to think about in terms of timing.
Thank you, Sarah. Are there other questions or comments?
This may be a little bit of a moot point now because we've moved beyond it, but I wanted to go back to something that Michael had mentioned, if it's okay, Madam Chair. We're talking about, because we've heard this from various stakeholders as well, there are a number of programs operating right now at no cost to the candidate through other grants. I think diversity in teaching is one, particularly for special ed and ELL, in terms of adding those additional endorsements using existing programs across the state. So I think that's just the other thing, to keep in mind is, where is this going to serve a unique need versus where do we have programs that are operating in a similar fashion and serving a similar need? And, again, wanting to bring newer and different models to the field for sure. I hear that loud and clear, but also aware of sort of potential duplication and, where is the energy best placed in terms of where the needs are. And I think the vacancy data is a big part of that, trying to drive this, as you said, Jack, based on where the needs are. But that was just something that struck me that Michael mentioned earlier.
Certainly. I mean, I think that is good feedback. I mean, one of the things I was just going to touch on is I mentioned at the beginning that this, I think we believe takes a village, takes effort on all sides. I think, Amy touched on some of the bills that we've seen moving through session this year that deal with teacher licensure. And there's other ones out there. There's one, I think one or two that attempt to get at this issue through endorsements, that we didn't talk about. And I think it just emphasizes the fact that there is a window opening up for this to, I think, work from multiple different sides and have an impact. And while yes, it's true that there are some options out there for educators to add endorsements for free. You mentioned special education. I think that this is a really good chance to kind of do something, hopefully, that is a little more broad and can be a little more tailored to local contexts as well. But definitely great feedback, and thank you again. I've been trying to keep up in my chicken scratch handwriting on this blank sheet of paper over here. Hopefully I'll be able to translate it well and share it back with the staff here. But again, I just wanted to say thank you for all of the feedback that you guys have shared.
Thank you, Jack. Appreciate the time with you. Moving on to the next agenda item, I believe we're ready. And happy to welcome our TACTI Executive Board members joining us today. And Amy, you and Erica may have a plan for how you want to lead us into this discussion with TACTI, so I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We did not have a very structured plan. That actually sounds like a great idea, but perhaps we can take it in reverse, given that we've just had such a robust discussion on the additional endorsement pathway. How about we start there, and then we could backtrack through PE endorsements or other topics of conversation. Does that work for you? Right.
Sounds good to me, if it's good with our TACTI folks.
Well, Tricia, you're welcome to begin, and then others can also join as well as you have thoughts and comments about that policy proposal.
I want to first start by saying we really very much appreciate being able to be part of the conversation. But I want to qualify all of our comments by saying that for most of these topics, with the exception probably of this last one, we haven't had an opportunity to really get to hear from our members. So we try very hard to represent what we believe others feel, but for the most part, this is like the opinions of a range of people who I trust, more so than speaking on behalf of TACTI as an organization. So I think quite a few of our group probably want to weigh in on this last one. I would just say that some of the questions that kind of remain in my mind are, if the primary goal of this is to deal with the teacher shortage, I am questioning whether providing additional endorsements for existing teachers is, when we know that we have shortages across such a wide range of disciplines, moving existing teachers from one role to another, I don't think it should be our primary means of closing the gap in a teacher shortage. There are many of us who offer programs. Tusculum offers dual endorsement special ed, and we have capacity in those programs, we're struggling to recruit students into the program. And we have, really like 100%, with the exception of 1 year out of like the last 6 years, we had 100% first time pass rate on the praxis. So it's a really solid program, but we have trouble getting students to be interested in special ed. So part of what I think needs to happen is we need to find a way to really market the field to prospective teachers who might not have really understood what it would mean to be a special education teacher. So I'm gonna be quiet and let those who have been a little bit more involved. Today is like 1 day short of 5 weeks since I came down with COVID, and I have not yet made it through a week of work. So, and I lose my wind pretty quickly. So I'm gonna be quiet, let others speak up.
I'll jump in there. My name is Dave Chiak. I'm the president-elect of TACTI, and speaking here today on behalf of TACTI. And I think, as Trish kind of mentioned, is that well, this issue we have been talking a lot with our other colleagues throughout the state. I've had the privilege of talking to public, private, large, small, east, west, and middle ed prep programs. And I think the goal is the same. We all are working towards no teacher vacancy and all Tennessee students having that highly qualified, effective teacher. I think the discussions surrounding this proposal has already driven a lot of positive change in ed prep programs. We've definitely have heard the issue of cost at times. And we hear that EPPs need to really look at innovation and being creative to really help, our local schools meet those staffing needs. And a lot of the conversations I've had with our other ed prep programs have been about how do we fulfill that mission, and how do we solve this problem of a teacher shortage and vacancy data. So we agree wholeheartedly with the motivation towards this proposal. Every Tennessee child needs a qualified and effective teacher. The vacancy data that was shared with us, so we did receive that, and I would like to thank the department for that. So even a 3% vacancy rate, I think there's 45,000 Tennessee teachers out there, 46,000. So even 3%, or the 20 special ed classrooms in East Tennessee core area that are either vacant or teachers on permit or teachers on waiver, those 20 classrooms, as reported in the most recent data, is too much. I agree. 3%, we got to get to 0. I have engaged with many of our partners and have kind of asked for that information regarding what are your needs. I mean, it's a continuous conversation that we have as ed prep programs with all of our state and primary partners, and I have about 70 statewide. And simply put, they aren't reporting this to us as a priority. Yes, we get individual requests like this one. Teacher is out of a permit, a waiver. We need this kind of add-on. But we have asked our LEA partners, and what they've communicated to us is that they do not have a need in terms of large amounts of existing teachers to add or add an additional endorsement. We stand ready to provide that model, and we have asked various LEAs that if you can send us to teachers, we will develop a model that will work. This could be because the majority of our programs collectively with ed preps across the state have moved to or have dual licensure opportunities. With the additional endorsements, models to fill high need positions, LEAs create vacancies to fill vacancy. And that's what I think our concern is that mathematically, if we're moving one teacher to another side of the school, are we replacing? That's not going to lower the vacancy rate. If there's a problem that is limited to or specific to a couple of LEAs, there are pathways for LEAs to become ed prep programs. We have Rutherford County, which is part of us, and we welcome them. And just looking at the data and the evidence that supports the issue of additional endorsements as a viable solution to the vacancy data. I think previously TACTI has shared information in regard about quality assurance and accountability. Those are two very strong pillars of an ed prep program. All you have to do is review the previous slides that you all discussed about the annual reports and the Tennessee report card. But it's those quality assurances and accountability that translates into a quality teacher. That's how we ensure Tennessee students have highly effective teachers. And like you and like the department, it's a collective responsibility of all of us to make sure every child has an effective teacher, and that, quite frankly, every parent has an effective teacher who can communicate their child's strengths and supports and overall well-being. And I do believe there is a difference between covering the standards and being accountable to those standards. And again, I think when we think about accountability, we are held to those, and we welcome that challenge. In terms of graduation, pass rates, level of effectiveness, retention, those are all very critical things that we take with the utmost responsibility every time we adapt, change, and rechange and revise to meet the needs of our LEAs. I'll hand it off to another TACTI person if they wanted to jump in.
Hi, I was hoping I could say something real quick. We serve about 60 of those candidates who are getting the special education endorsement through the grant. And I wanted to just speak to two things. One, I know there was some concern over endorsing candidates who don't have experience through an online course in special education settings, but for us, that's not true. I'm at Carson Newman, and I'm a special educator myself, and so the courses that they take, they do have practicum opportunities. They are supervised by someone at their school, and so we are proud of our program. We're proud of the experiences that they have. So just to speak to that. The second thing, and this has come up recently as our candidates are finishing up coursework this summer and signing up to take praxis exams. We have many elementary teachers who, if their license was obtained 5 years, older than 5 years, they're older than 5 years, they have to retake the teaching reading praxis exam. And that was just one of the things that we felt like we're getting a little bit of pushback from our teachers who, they've been in the field for a long time. They are literacy, they're teachers of reading, and they're kind of like, why are you making me retake this exam? So that's just 2 points that I wanted to make as we talk about just what we're doing.
Thank you to all three of you for providing that input. Is there anything else on any of the other topics? Because I know we were trying to go backwards on the agenda to see if there was anything in addition that you wanted to provide to us. And so this is just a wonderful opportunity for us to hear directly from you. I know several of us mentioned it along the way as the presentations were being made. I know I said it several times, I want to know what you all think about this. And so, looking at the agenda, and I'm just thinking, Amy or Elizabeth, if we could go back to the beginning, just to make sure that we've not missed anything. I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but if there is anything that you did not have a chance to speak to, certainly welcome additional input while we're here together.
This is, go ahead. Go ahead.
This is Natalie. No, I'm on my phone, and I apologize for that. But I do want to mention just a couple of things. I know also another fear
I'm
of
not sure if others are
Texas
hearing you clearly,
scores.
Renee. You're breaking up at my end. Can you all hear?
Oh, she's breaking up for me too.
Hang it. Sorry. I'm going to let somebody else talk and I'll connect with my.
Okay. I can weigh in a little bit about PE. So we offer the PE degree, and we also offer that in our MT program. We get some feedback. Okay. We struggle to recruit to that program. We have a really robust sport science and sport management program. Each one of those is typically enrolled 80 to 100 students. And in that same department where PE lives, we might have 3 PE students for a lot of reasons, because most of the other sport programs don't require a student teaching semester, which can be really intimidating to a student athlete because most of our PE majors are student athletes. And the practice exam is a major issue. So our pass rates are abysmal and are significantly below any other praxis test, like by a lot. I think most students who take that test just say it's just incredibly difficult. So my assessment is, I haven't taken it, but just from anecdotal evidence from students, I tend to think it's one of the more challenging tests. I think across the state, it has one of the lowest pass rates. I'd like to see us take a look at the alignment between the test and the standards that we're teaching to in the state, because I'm questioning whether or not there might be a bit of a misalignment. And I'm saying we have students who are pretty successful throughout the program and then, are taking the test multiple times and not passing. So that's really discouraging. And then word gets out and other students are saying, well, I'm not going to major in that, because I'm going to go through a whole program and then at the end, not be able to teach. So that one is a tough one. I think you would see a major change if there was a change in that praxis test.
Thank you for that feedback, because that's exactly what we were talking about, and we know that there's something wrong. And I appreciate you bringing up the alignment to the test. Clearly, that needs to take place. That's great input. Thank you for that. Other input on the PE endorsement?
This is Donna Neville at UT Martin. I said before, we also saw a misalignment, but rather than looking at changing the test, our faculty took it on themselves to change their curriculum based on what they learned as they took the test. So that's one idea.
Yeah, and I would say there's a lot of, I'm sure that would make a difference if we align our instruction more to the test. But I do think we need to go back and look at the test and see if the test is aligned to what we're supposed to be teaching. I have some of our most senior faculty members in that program. He is probably a 40-year member of TAFERD, and so is very attuned to what the PE standards are. He's been part of the team that drafts them, and he's a lead faculty member in that department, and we're still really struggling. Another thing to consider, I'm hearing that our PE students are also really struggling with the EdTPA, that it's a very different model than the other EdTPAs, and it makes sense to me. But when you've got a single EdTPA coordinator who is supporting all of the different EdTPA, what's the word I'm looking for? All the different EdTPA content areas.
Yeah.
To have one that's like seriously different in structure than the others makes it really hard to support. So I think as we're, at the state level, if you're looking at alignment and you're looking at data, you might want to also examine the TPA scores in that endorsement area.
That's great feedback too, and I'm sure that Amy and Michael are taking copious notes here. What else do you want to share with us?
We might have Renee back. Renee, do you want to try again?
Sure. Yeah. Can you hear me better now?
Yes.
Okay. I guess to piggyback off what Tricia was saying too, I was trying to make some notes. It's been, and you all can help me, it's been several years ago that the pass rate or the pass score for PE was raised, and it was raised significantly during that time period. Time flies when we're having fun. So it's probably been within the last 7 or 8 years. And when I say it was raised significant, it seemed like it was like 15 points or so. And so that's when, we began to see that decline of the pass rate. And it has been something that I've seen across the state. Also, Bill Estes and I met with Bob Eby several weeks ago we pulled ETS data to look at not national, but state averages when it comes to pass rate, not only for PE, but across the board, at looking at just what's the impact for our students of color when we look at praxis pass rates. And that was eye-opening for me to not only look at just what I would consider praxis 2 content, but also we dug deep into the core and looking at that requirement and what the impact is for our students of color. So that's something internally we're looking at UTC, but I think that's something that I think would be significant for the state board to also review to see what the impact of the praxis is on our students of color. Especially when that's our focus is on increasing diversity.
I think that's a great suggestion. Thank you, Renee. Other?
This is Bob. I have that data that I'll share with the board.
Are you ready to move to another topic?
Yes, if you are.
Sure. Anybody else in the group want to speak up on PE before we move on? Okay, so I guess we'll go to licensure reactivation and renewal. I do think, what you all discussed about having better data to make this decision would be helpful. There are those rare situations where we're dealing with a student who took their exam a long time ago and didn't pass and would like to get a license. And, we're telling them basically go back to the drawing board. You probably have been out for too long. So I think some of the data you will effectively get from looking at what the department is aware of. But then there are also going to be those students who EPPs deal with who maybe aren't going to become teachers because of that 5-year time frame. It could be that they passed one of the tests and not the other and got discouraged and kind of walked away. And now they're faced with having to retake all of them. Especially in endorsements that require the passage of more than one test, like special ed.
Other?
I will echo that as well. And especially in an area such as special education where there are multiple tests that need to be completed. When we think about that expiration of the praxis post 5 years, it does become a barrier, especially people that are seeking that additional endorsement.
Yeah, and personally, for my own kids, my kids are a little bit older now, but I would have much rather had a rusty but qualified person in the classroom than someone who was completely out of field. Because somebody who's just been out for a while can get up to speed pretty quickly.
Thank you. We'll definitely work on the data collection end in terms of the staff. And then I know that y'all have seen the report card, obviously, in February. The annual reports are forthcoming, and we will have many, many opportunities to talk about both of those things in the coming months. But if there's any just immediate concerns or things you want us to be aware of, please feel free to share.
From my point of view, I just want to join everyone in thanking Erica, Michael, with the annual reports and EPP card. We love the new disaggregation in the EPP report card. We're using the data to improve our programs, to collaborate with other ed prep programs. We're very excited about the development of the candidate level file for further investigation. So thank you so much. It really helps us in terms of that continuous improvement and collaboration with partners and fellow EPPs.
I have one more comment back to the proposed additional endorsement pathway as it relates to special ed. Our add-on endorsement program at the graduate level it's 19 credit hours. We're probably one of the cheapest that everybody says don't use the word cheap. Cheap implies that you don't have value. We're one of the best values in graduate education and special ed, because our tuition, and we don't have with very minimal fees, like $10 per course. Okay, so our tuition is $400 per credit hour, which is very reasonable at the graduate level. But we recently, right around the time when I came, so maybe 4 or so years ago, revised that program to meet the new standards, and that program was approved in our site visit. And it really took 19 graduate level credits to meet all the requirements of all the standards. If we could have done it in less credits, we would have. So that's another thing I just want to throw out. I want to be mindful that, in our effort to be cost conscious, I want to be sure that we're not shortcutting what the state has determined special ed teachers really need to know and be able to do in order to serve their students. And if the end result is a bit of a fast track that would be less intensive, then we also need to go back to the drawing board with our additional endorsement programs to say potentially we could pare those down and make them not quite as challenging. I mean, I don't mean less difficult, but I mean less credit hours, which would cut down on the expense and the time to completion. So I think we don't do one without the other. So if we come up with a more a speedier pathway that is less intensive, then we need to also revisit our additional endorsement programs across the state within EPPs.
Several of us are nodding our heads, so thank you so much for that too. Amy, go ahead.
Just one comment on this. One thing I think we don't want to forget, and as we look through this additional endorsement path, is, I think as Mike had brought up too before, accountability. And if we were to add a path on for somebody that had been out for 5 years or 7 years or whatever, and gave them an endorsement somewhere, that accountability, whether it's with TDOE, if they provide the license, or if it's the EPP that provides an add-on to them, and we need to be sure that we don't lose that accountability in the process.
And I'd like to, on behalf of TACTI, we appreciate the dialogue and really look forward to collaborating to solve that teacher shortage, problem in a very meaningful way. Whether we're looking at initial endorsements, we're looking at dual endorsements. And so we really welcome, that opportunity to further partner and collaborate with the Department of Ed in terms of strengthening, all pathways for anybody at any time to become that teacher that they, aspire to become. I will say on one other issue, I saw that was up there, and I just wanted to say that, related to, and maybe it's a future discussion, so I might have missed that, and I apologize in advance. But the removal of the ACT, SAT kind of requirements, I just wanted to be clear that, EPPs are not advocating for lower standards, but rather a proposal that we held accountable for our outcomes or the preparation of our educators rather than our inputs, admission criteria, and we really look forward to being part of, those equitable assessments moving forward.
Something just to kind of reiterate that that might be of interest to the board is the fact that many of our universities are no longer even using the ACT as an admissions requirement, which then puts us in a little bit of a situation in which students then, obviously everyone has to take the core knowledge praxis exam if they did not take the ACT. And I thought at first it was going to be more of a reaction to COVID, but I'm not sure that this will not now become more of a policy and a permanent change so that students can use their GPA instead of their ACT score. So that just might be something that the board might find interesting as you think about and consider these situations.
Yeah, thanks for that, Renee. I saw something in some of my alumni magazines about just the record number of admissions or applications last year because that was not a factor in the admission decision. So it will be interesting to see if that's a trend, and definitely something we're going to need to keep our eyes on in terms of how we think about our frameworks and expectations.
And I'll reiterate, I'm part of those discussions at my university, and we're really looking at studying that long term. And if you look at a lot of our neighboring states, they're already on board with it. So, there is that ripple effect, especially as the requirements for that additional cost, of the praxis core.
Well, and I was at CAPE, their virtual conference, and they have revised their standards and taken out the formal assessment requirement and instead are pointing more towards just a cohort GPA. And I cannot tell you the number of advising appointments I have with advisees who have excellent GPAs, are excellent students, and simply don't have the ACT or the praxis core passed due to, whatever happened in high school. And we struggle to get that to happen so that we can admit them to the teacher education program.
All very good input and a great discussion. Is there anything else either from the TACT executive board or anybody from the TDOE or our staff? Yes.
Kim Hawkins is trying to get in. But she said she doesn't think her mic is working. But
is it working now? I'm playing with my settings.
Tim.
Can you hear me now? I'm just trying to talk. I love that Bob Evie is calling on me. Great to see you, Bob. I would just like for you all to consider with regard to this ACT issue that the annual reports, as Michael spoke about earlier, will be removing that ACT entrance or praxis core from the scoring. So I just wonder if that's something that you all are considering, those of you who deal with report card, if you're considering aligning report card with that.
We actually were in the vanguard. We removed it first.
Okay, good.
It is it is a reported but unscored metric.
Thank you.
You bet.
Thank you for that clarification. So glad my microphone got to work for that one little thing.
I'm glad to hear from you anyway.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments or discussion points before we get ready to adjourn? I think we've had a great discussion. This particular topic with TACTI, I'm so thankful that you have joined us. I hope you will join us again. Hearing directly from you and getting your input is invaluable to us as we, not only for this subcommittee, but certainly for the other work of the state board when we are in meetings and voting and passing policies and rules. So thank you so much for being here today. Any other closing comments from anyone else? any of our board members or Dr. Morrison before we adjourn?
This has been really, really helpful to me, and having TACTI as part of it has added a lot to it too. Thank you.
This is Sarah. I was just, sorry, Mike.
I agree exactly with what Bob said, tacky, but the whole day I think it's been productive.
Thank you all. And again, thank you so much to all of our presenters, our team members from the State Board and the Tennessee Department of Education. The partnership is incredible to the success of our work, or we need this collaboration to continue and to support the work that we're doing as a board for Tennessee education and for our students. Without objection, we stand adjourned. Thank you all so much and have a great rest of the day.
Thanks, everyone.